Picture a hull the color of a storm cloud, sliding by inches into grey water, and consider this quiet claim, that after this single launch, no Navy's wooden fleet anywhere in the world was ever truly safe again. The ship was called HMS Warrior, and she was not built to fight a battle. She was built to end an age. For 2 centuries, the great navies of Europe had measured their strength in oak, in towering walls of timber, in ranks of gun ports cut into curved wooden sides, in masts and canvas that had not changed in any fundamental way since the time of Drake. Warrior did not defeat that world in combat. She made it obsolete simply by existing, floating dark and silent on the Solent, built of iron where every other warship afloat was still built of wood. This is not, in the end, a story of battle. Warrior never fired her guns in anger. No enemy hull ever felt the weight of her broadside. No boarding party ever crossed her deck in violence. And yet, she's one of the most consequential warships ever built, because her mere presence rewrote the arithmetic of naval power overnight. This is a story of iron instead of oak, of steam instead of wind alone, of an ambition that moved quietly through a private shipyard on the Thames and emerged as something the world's admiralties had not yet learned to imagine. It is a story about the moment naval power changed forever, not through fire, but through engineering. To understand what Warrior meant, it helps to sit for a moment inside the world she was born into. This was the 1850s, and Portsmouth was the beating heart of the Royal Navy, a harbour crowded with wooden walls that had, in one form or another, kept Britain safe and ascendant since the age of Nelson. The ships that rode at anchor there were things of immense craft and long tradition. 3-decked ships of the line, their sides built from oak grown and seasoned for decades. Their gun decks arranged in the same basic pattern that had proven itself at Trafalgar. Sailors who walked those decks in 1858 could reasonably believe that the essential shape of naval warfare was settled, that wood and sail and cannon would define the contest of empires for a good while yet. The Navy had, in a sense, grown comfortable. It had won its wars. It ruled the waves in the fleet it already possessed. And comfort, as it so often does, bred a certain quiet confidence that nothing fundamental was about to change. There is something almost peaceful in imagining that world just before the change arrived. The creak of rigging in Portsmouth harbour, the smell of tar and salt, officers in blue coats discussing gunnery and seamanship in terms their grandfathers would have understood perfectly well. No alarm bells rang in the Admiralty in those years. No one in the wardrooms of the wooden fleet imagined that the ship which would render their world obsolete was, at that very moment, being conceived not by the Royal Navy's own dockyards, but by a private ironworks on the River Thames, in response to a threat that had begun, as these things so often do, with a rival's ambition across the Channel. France had built an ironclad first. La Gloire, launched just before Warrior was conceived, was armoured in iron plate, bolted over a timber hull. And though her wooden bones remained essentially conventional, her iron skin was enough to unsettle a British Admiralty that had spent a century assuming its wooden supremacy was simply a fact of the natural order. It was not panic exactly that moved the Admiralty to respond. Panic is too loud a word for the slow, deliberate way navies actually behave. But it was something more than ordinary caution. There was a recognition, quiet but unmistakable, that the old rules no longer held, that a wooden hull, however thick, however lovingly built, could no longer be assumed proof against the guns of a determined enemy. And so the order went out, not for another wooden ship reinforced with iron, but for something else entirely. A hull built from iron from the very beginning. A ship conceived not as a wooden vessel improved, but as an entirely different kind of thing. This is the quiet drama at the heart of Warrior's story. Not a battle, but a decision. Somewhere in the offices of the Admiralty, among men whose names are recorded but whose private thoughts we can only imagine, a choice was made that the Royal Navy would not simply match the French ship for ship, but would leap past her, building something larger, faster, and more thoroughly modern than anything La Gloire represented. It was ambition wearing the calm face of policy, the kind of decision that reads, in the official records, as a simple line item, an order placed, a contract signed, but which in fact marked the moment when the future of naval power quietly changed direction. The contract did not go to one of the Royal Navy's own historic dockyards, the yards that had built the ships of Trafalgar and the wars before it. It went instead to the Thames Iron Works and Shipbuilding Company, a private yard on the river at Blackwall, a place more accustomed in earlier years to building merchant vessels and smaller craft than to raising the largest and most advanced warship in the world. This in itself was a quiet sign of how much was changing. The old dockyards, steeped in generations of oak-built tradition, were not the obvious home for a ship built from iron plate on an iron frame, driven by steam as much as sail. The future of naval construction, it turned out, lay closer to the industrial furnaces and rolling mills of private engineering firms than to the ancient royal yards where wooden ships had always been born. There is a certain hush that settles over this part of the story, a sense of something enormous beginning without fanfare. No trumpets announced the contract. No newspapers in those first months understood quite what was being attempted on the Thames. The work began the way all great undertakings seem to begin in retrospect. Quietly, methodically, with iron plates ordered from foundries, with drawings revised and re-revised, with engineers and shipwrights working out, almost from first principles, how a hull of this kind should even be built. Iron shipbuilding was not entirely new by 1859. Merchant iron hulls had been built for some years. But a warship of Warrior's scale, armed and armoured as a fighting vessel, was something closer to invention than to repetition. Every choice, from the thickness of the iron plate to the arrangement of the watertight compartments below her waterline, had to be worked out with only partial precedent to guide it. It is worth pausing here, before the story moves further into the shipyard and the rising hull, to sit with the strangeness of the moment itself. The strangeness of an empire's naval supremacy being quietly redrawn not on a battlefield, not in a dramatic clash of fleets, but in the slow accumulation of iron plates on a private slipway beside the Thames, largely unnoticed by the public that would one day marvel at the finished ship. This is the nature of true turning points in history. They rarely announce themselves. They arrive as contracts and drawings, as orders placed and iron delivered, and only later, once the finished thing rises dark and enormous from its scaffolding, does the world understand that something has fundamentally changed before this story moves further, into the ironworks itself, into the vast labour of raising an iron hull unlike any built before it. It is worth pausing simply to sit with the atmosphere of the age. An empire secure in its wooden supremacy, unaware that supremacy was already slipping away, and a shipyard on the Thames quietly assembling the instrument of that change. If stories like this one hold some appeal for you, of great ships, the ambitions that built them, and the water that eventually claimed them all in one way or another, you are welcome to stay and to find more of them here in the time ahead. For now, let the picture rest as it began. A dark hull yet to be launched, a navy of oak yet to understand what was coming, and a private yard on a quiet stretch of river where the age of wooden warships was, without anyone quite realizing it yet, already coming to its end. The Thames moved as it always had, grey and patient, indifferent to the enormous thing being conceived along its banks. Portsmouth's wooden walls stood at anchor as they always had, confident in a supremacy that had, in truth, only a few short years left to run. And somewhere between those two places, between the harbour that trusted in oak and the ironworks that would end that trust forever, the story of Warrior truly begins. In the middle years of the 1850s, the Royal Navy stood at what many of its officers believed to be the summit of naval history. A fleet so complete in its craft, so refined by centuries of accumulated knowledge, that it seemed less like a human achievement than a natural law. The ships of the line that rode at anchor in Portsmouth and Plymouth and the great fleet anchorage at Spithead were, by any measure available at the time, the most sophisticated machines that human beings had yet built. Each one represented the labor of entire forests, felled and seasoned and shaped by generations of shipwrights whose skills had been passed down, father to son, master to apprentice, in an unbroken chain stretching back to the Tudor dockyards. A single first-rate ship of the line might contain the timber of 2,000 mature oaks, drawn from estates and royal forests across England, each tree selected years in advance for the particular curve or straightness required by a particular part of the hull. The result, when finished, was an object of genuine beauty. 3 tiers of guns, black hulls banded in white or buff, a forest of masts and rigging so precise in its geometry that foreign visitors often remarked that English warships looked less like weapons than like cathedrals afloat. There was, in this beauty, a deep and comfortable confidence. Britain had spent the better part of a century building and defending a navy that had, by the 1850s, no serious rival anywhere on the earth. The victories of the Napoleonic Wars were still within living memory, carried forward in the stories of old admirals and in the rigging drills still practiced exactly as they had been practiced at Trafalgar. The fleet's dominance was not merely a matter of national pride, it was the foundation of an entire imperial system, the thread that connected a small island in the North Atlantic to colonies and coaling stations and trading posts scattered across every ocean. Wooden ships of the line, reinforced by decades of design refinement, armed with smoothbore guns whose basic principles had changed little since the 17th century, were assumed, quietly, comfortably, almost unconsciously, to be permanent. Naval architecture, so the thinking went, had reached a kind of natural ceiling. There might be improvements in speed, in the arrangement of sails, in the comfort of the crew's quarters, but the fundamental form of the wooden warship, the same broad shape that had defeated the Spanish Armada and Napoleon's fleets in turn, seemed unlikely to be surpassed. It was a comfortable assumption, and like most comfortable assumptions, it rested on foundations that had not been tested in a very long time. The first hairline cracks in that confidence appeared not in Britain, but in the memory of a battle fought years before, at Sinop, on the shores of the Black Sea, where a Russian squadron had destroyed an Ottoman fleet using explosive shells fired from naval guns rather than the solid round shot that had defined naval gunnery for centuries. The distinction seemed technical at first, a matter of ordnance rather than of hulls, but naval architects who studied the reports understood almost immediately what it implied. Solid shot, however heavy, punched holes in wooden hulls that could often be plugged, patched, or simply endured. A wooden ship, built of oak 2 feet thick in places, could absorb an extraordinary punishment from round shot and still float, still fight, still limp home for repair. Explosive shells were different. They did not merely punch through timber. They burst inside it, showering splinters through gun decks crowded with men, setting fire to tarred rigging and dry planking, opening wounds in a hull that no amount of oak thickness could fully prevent. The ships destroyed at Sinope had been wooden through and through, built along lines that would have been perfectly familiar to a shipwright of Nelson's era, and they had been annihilated in a matter of hours. The lesson was not lost on the naval architects and ordnance experts who examined the reports in London and Paris alike, though for a time it remained a subject of quiet technical discussion rather than public alarm, a worry confined to committee rooms and private correspondence. not yet the kind of concern that reached the newspapers or the public imagination. It was in France, not in Britain, that this worry first hardened into action. The French Navy, ever conscious of its position as the Royal Navy's most persistent rival, had watched the implications of explosive shell fire with rather less complacency than their British counterparts. French naval engineers, working under the direction of the shipbuilder Dupuy de l'Homme, began to explore a radical solution. Not merely thicker wood, which had obvious limits, but the application of iron plate to the exterior of a wooden hull, creating armour in the truest sense, a skin that explosive shells could not easily penetrate. The result of this thinking, launched at Toulon in November of 1859, was a vessel named La Gloire, a wooden-hulled frigate sheathed from waterline to gun deck in wrought iron plates some 4.5 inches thick. She was not, in the strictest sense, a fully iron ship. Her frame and hull remained timber, iron applied as armour rather than as structure. But she was armoured in a way that no warship in history had ever been armoured before, and she carried guns capable of a broadside that, combined with her iron skin, made her theoretically invulnerable to anything a wooden warship could throw against her. News of La Gloire's launch reached London with the particular force that only a genuine strategic shock can produce. For decades, the Admiralty had measured its security in numbers. So many ships of the line, so many guns, so many tons of shipping, tallied against the French fleet and found reliably superior. La Gloire rendered that entire calculus obsolete in a single stroke, because the comparison was no longer between comparable ships in different quantities, but between two fundamentally different kinds of vessel. A wooden ship of the line, however numerous, however skillfully sailed, however proud its history, could not withstand sustained fire from an ironclad, while an ironclad could withstand fire from an entire line of wooden ships with something approaching impunity. The Royal Navy's numerical superiority, built up over a century of building, maintained at enormous expense, defended as the guarantee of Britain's global position, had, in the space of a single French shipyard's work, become almost meaningless. It was, in the private assessments circulating through the Admiralty in the early weeks of 1860, not merely a setback, but something closer to a crisis, though one conducted with the particular, quiet, controlled anxiety of officials who understood that panic would serve no one. The atmosphere in London through those early months of 1860 was not one of visible alarm. There were no public demonstrations, no newspaper headlines proclaiming disaster, no immediate admission from the Admiralty that its wooden fleet had been rendered obsolete. Instead, there was a kind of held breath, a stillness among the men who understood what La Gloire represented. A recognition passed quietly between First Lords and controllers and chief constructors that the wooden navy, for all its beauty, for all its discipline, for all its centuries of accumulated craft, could no longer be assumed to be sufficient. The oak forests that had built Portsmouth's fleet, the generations of shipwrights who had passed their knowledge down unchanged, the entire self-confident architecture of British naval supremacy, all of it now depended on an answer to a question that had, until recently, seemed unnecessary to ask. Could Britain build something to match what France had built? And could she build it quickly enough to matter? The ships still rode at anchor at Spithead exactly as they always had, their masts bare against the grey, solent sky, their guns and rigging and hulls unchanged from the fleet that had faced Napoleon. But in the offices of the Admiralty, among the men who understood iron and shells and the mathematics of naval power, the certainty that had defined British naval thinking for a generation had already, quietly and almost imperceptibly, begun to give way. The response, when it came, arrived not as a proclamation, but as paperwork. This was the peculiar genius and the peculiar danger of the Admiralty in those years. that matters of the gravest consequence were conducted in the same measured hand as matters of routine, that a request which might alter the balance of naval power across the world could be filed alongside requisitions for rope and biscuit, initialed, countersigned, and passed along without any outward sign of alarm. The surveyor of the Navy, Sir Baldwin Walker, had watched the French announcements with the attentiveness of a man who had long suspected this day would come. And when confirmation reached him that gloire was not a rumour, but a keel already laid, he did not write in the language of crisis. He wrote in the language of committees. He requested designs. He requested estimates. He requested, in the dry phrasing of naval correspondence, that consideration be given to the construction of a vessel or vessels capable of meeting the requirements of the service under the new conditions now prevailing. It was a sentence built to contain an emergency inside the shape of a memorandum, and it worked in the way such sentences were meant to work. It moved the matter forward without ever admitting how urgent the matter truly was. But beneath the calm, bureaucratic surface, the pace of decision was extraordinary. Committees that might ordinarily have taken years to resolve a question of naval design resolved this one in months. Estimates were requested and returned within weeks. The First Lord of the Admiralty, aware that the balance so recently disturbed by France could not be allowed to settle in France's favour even briefly, pressed for speed at every stage, and the peculiar machinery of the Admiralty, so often slow and so often cautious, found itself moving with an urgency that surprised even those who worked within it. There is a kind of speed that dresses itself in calm, and this was it. No shouting, no public alarm, only meetings convened a little sooner than usual. Correspondence answered a little faster than convention required, and a sense, unspoken but present in every room where the matter was discussed, that Britain could not afford to be second in this by more than the barest possible margin. What emerged from these deliberations was not, in the end, a simple matter of matching France ship for ship. The Admiralty's ambition, once it had fully formed, reached further than parity. Gloire was formidable, but she remained, in her essential construction, a wooden hull wearing iron. Her timbers still bore the weight of her armour. Her design still carried the compromises of an older shipbuilding tradition, adapted rather than replaced. The men who now set about designing Britain's answer understood that a wooden hull clad in iron plate was a transitional thing, a first attempt at solving a problem that had not yet been solved completely. They wanted something further. They wanted a ship built of iron from her keel upward, iron not applied to a hull, but constituting the hull itself, a vessel whose strength came not from a shell wrapped around timber, but from a single continuous material carrying its own load. It was a more radical proposition than anything France had yet attempted, and it carried risks that a purely defensive response would not have carried. To simply armour a wooden ship was to work within a known tradition, however new the armour itself might be. To build a ship entirely of iron, at a size and speed no vessel had yet achieved, was to step into territory where the old rules of naval architecture no longer applied, and the new rules had not yet been written. The task of designing this ship fell to Isaac Watts, the chief constructor of the Navy, a man who had spent his career among the incremental changes of wooden shipbuilding and who now found himself asked to conceive something that broke almost entirely from everything he had known. Watts was not a reckless man, nor one given to grand pronouncements about the future of naval warfare. The surviving accounts of his work describe a careful, methodical approach to a problem that offered him very few precedents to draw upon. Iron hulls existed already in merchant service, built for river and coastal trade, but nothing had been attempted at the scale now proposed, and nothing had been asked to carry the weight of guns and armour across open ocean in conditions that would test a ship far more severely than any cargo run ever could. Watts reasoned, according to the logic that shaped his design, that iron offered advantages a wooden hull with iron plating could never match. An iron hull could be built lighter for the same strength, allowing for greater speed. It could be built to a larger size without the structural compromises that timber imposed. Since wood had a natural limit to how long a hull could be before it began to work and flex in a seaway, a limit that had constrained wooden shipbuilding for centuries. Iron, properly framed and plated, offered no such ceiling, or so the reasoning went, untested as it still was at this scale. A larger hull meant more powerful engines could be carried, more coal, more guns, more armour, and greater speed than any rival, wooden or ironclad, could achieve. The vision that took shape under Watts's hand was not merely a ship to match Gloire. It was a ship intended to make Gloire, however formidable she seemed in the moment, appear already outdated. The scale of what was being proposed becomes clearer when set against the ordinary caution that had governed naval expenditure in the decades before. Shipbuilding budgets in the years preceding this decision had followed a familiar, conservative rhythm. Improvements made gradually, costs weighed carefully against a fleet that already held its advantage and had little need to gamble. What was now authorized departed sharply from that pattern. The sum committed to this single vessel exceeded what had been spent on any previous ship in the Navy's history, a fact that did not escape the attention of those in Parliament who would eventually be asked to account for it. The ship proposed would be longer than any warship yet built, faster than any ironclad afloat, more heavily armed than Gloire, and constructed of a material whose long-term behavior under the stresses of a warship's life. The pounding of waves, the recoil of heavy guns, the slow work of salt water against metal, remained in truth a matter of informed estimation rather than proven fact. No one committing funds to this design could point to a ship of comparable size that had already demonstrated iron construction was equal to the task. The nearest evidence lay in smaller vessels, in merchant hulls, in engineering principles reasoned forward from what had worked at lesser scale. The leap from those precedents to a ship of this size was considerable, and everyone involved in authorizing it understood, even if the language of the memoranda did not say so plainly, that they were committing an unprecedented sum to a technology that had never been proven at the scale now demanded of it. There is a particular kind of quiet that surrounds decisions of this magnitude when they are made by careful men in careful rooms. A quiet that has nothing to do with the absence of doubt and everything to do with the suppression of it. The engineers and administrators who signed off on this design were not naive about what they risked. Iron shipbuilding was young. The calculations governing how an iron hull would behave under the stress of heavy seas, how it would respond to the shock of gunfire, how its plates would hold against the slow, creeping corrosion of salt water over years of service, rested on theory extended from smaller examples rather than direct proof at this scale. A ship built entirely wrong, undergunned, or structurally unsound, or simply too experimental to trust in battle, would represent not just a wasted sum, but a strategic embarrassment at precisely the moment Britain could least afford one. And yet to hesitate, to wait for more certainty before committing, was to risk the opposite failure, to watch France press whatever advantage Gloire represented while Britain deliberated her way into irrelevance. The decision, when finally made, carried within it both the confidence of men who believed iron construction was the future of naval power and the private uncertainty of men who could not yet prove that confidence correct. It was this tension, held quietly beneath the calm surface of committee minutes and appropriations, that would attend every stage of the work to come. The tension between what innovation promised and what only the sea itself could ultimately confirm. The yard chosen to carry this uncertainty forward lay downriver from the city, at Blackwall, where the Thames widened and slowed, as though pausing to consider the weight it would soon be asked to bear. Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company was not, in the year the contract was signed, a name spoken with the same reverence as the Royal Dockyards at Chatham or Portsmouth. It was a private concern, younger than the Navy's own traditions, built on the ambitions of men who had wagered that iron would remake the world of ships as thoroughly as steam had already remade the world of engines. The Admiralty's choice of this yard, rather than one of its own, was itself a quiet admission that the skills required for this hull did not yet fully exist within the Navy's own establishments, and that they would have to be found or invented somewhere else. The Blackwall Works occupied a stretch of riverbank that had, within living memory, built ships of timber and little else. Now the yard was given over to a hybrid trade, one whose practitioners were still discovering its own rules. Wooden shipwrights who had spent decades learning the gyve and grain of oak found themselves standing beside ironworkers who spoke a different language entirely. One of tensile strength and rivet patterns, of plates rolled to a tolerance no adze could ever achieve. The two trades did not so much merge as learn to coexist, each borrowing from the other what it could, each remaining faintly suspicious of what it could not yet verify. It was said, in later accounts of the yard, that a shipwright of 30 years' experience could still be seen in those months pacing along a half-formed iron frame with the same measured, testing tread he might once have used upon a timber keel, as though his feet alone could tell him whether the new material would hold. The materials gathered at Blackwall told their own story of an industry still in transition. Iron plate arrived by barge and by rail, rolled at foundries inland, and carried down to the yard in quantities that dwarfed anything the shipbuilding trade had handled before. The plate was not uniform in the way modern steel would later become. Each sheet carried the particular character of the furnace that had made it, and the ironworkers who received it learned to read these small variations by eye and by hand, tapping a plate with a hammer to hear whether its ring spoke of soundness or of a flaw hidden within. Wrought iron framing formed the skeleton beneath these plates, a lattice of ribs and stringers built up piece by piece, each joint riveted by hand in a process that would repeat itself many thousands of times before the hull was done. And beneath the iron, running the length of the ship, lay teak, a timber chosen not for tradition's sake alone, but for its particular density and resistance to rot, laid as a backing between the iron skin and the frames it sheathed. This layering of iron over iron again was, in its way, an honest picture of the age itself, a technology not yet willing to abandon entirely the materials it was in the process of replacing, but reaching forward all the same. The men who worked this hybrid structure into being were, for the most part, learning their trade as they practiced it. There existed no long lineage of iron shipwrights to draw upon, no guild of craftsmen who could claim to have built a hull of this kind before, because no hull of this kind had yet been built. The engineers who drew the plans worked from calculations that were themselves new, extrapolated from smaller iron vessels and from the emerging science of structural strength, but untested at anything approaching the scale now being attempted. Foremen who had spent their careers directing the shaping of timber frames found themselves directing instead the positioning of iron plates weighing many tons apiece, maneuvered by chain and pulley into place along the ribs, held while the riveters began their work. It was a slow education conducted in public, on an open slipway, with a result that could not be concealed if it went wrong. Every plate set, every rivet driven, was in some sense an experiment whose outcome would only be confirmed when the completed hull was finally asked to bear the sea's own judgment. The yard itself, in these months, took on the character of a place caught between two ages of craft. Furnaces glowed along one edge of the works, heating rivets to the cherry-red heat at which they could be driven home, and, cooling, draw the plates tight against one another with a strength no bolt could match. The sound of hammers was constant, not the single, resonant blow of a shipwright's mallet against timber, but a rhythm of smaller, sharper strikes, dozens of riveting teams working at once along the lengthening hull, their hammers ringing against hot iron in a chorus that carried out across the water on quiet evenings. The smell of the yard was equally a mixture of ages, the tang of hot metal and coal smoke from the furnaces mingling with the more familiar scents of tar and cut timber that had always marked a shipyard, and beneath both, the particular smell of the river itself, thick with silt and the traffic of 100 other vessels passing beyond the yard's gates. Visitors who came to see the work, and there were many, drawn by curiosity or by professional interest or simply by the rumor that something unprecedented was rising at Blackwall, described a scene that seemed to belong to no single era. Men in the leather aprons of an old trade, working alongside furnaces that would not have been out of place in an ironworks far from any river, the half-built hull rising above them like the ribs of some vast creature not yet fully formed. Iron and timber interleaved in a way that made it difficult, from a distance, to say whether one was looking at a ship or at the skeleton of an idea still being tested against reality. Not everyone who watched this work believed it would succeed. Among naval officers, there were those who accepted the reasoning behind iron construction in principle, while privately doubting whether a hull of such unprecedented size, built from a material with so little proven history at sea, could truly answer to the demands that would be placed upon it. Iron, some argued, might resist a shell in a way timber could not, but iron was also unforgiving in ways timber was not. It did not flex and settle as oak did, and a flaw hidden within a plate or a rivet might not announce itself until the moment of greatest strain at sea, far from any yard that could offer repair. There were officers who spoke, in the measured language of official correspondence, of the need for caution, for further trial, for smaller vessels to prove the principle, before so great an investment was committed to a single untested hull. Their reservations were not born of ignorance, but of a professional caution earned through long careers spent trusting their lives to timber they understood. And their concerns did not vanish simply because the keel had already been laid. Beyond the Navy, the wider public regarded the work at Blackwall with an equally divided curiosity. Newspapers of the day printed accounts of the ship's progress alongside letters from readers who asked, in tones ranging from genuine puzzlement to open skepticism, how a vessel built of iron could possibly float at all when every child understood that iron sank and wood did not. The engineers and officers who understood the principle of displacement, that a hull's ability to float depended not on the density of its material, but on the volume of water it displaced, found themselves explaining this repeatedly, in print and in conversation, to a public whose intuitions about iron and water ran deep and were not easily unseated by an argument, however sound. Even among those who accepted that the ship would float, there remained the harder question of whether she could fight, whether a hull of this unfamiliar material, however strong on paper, would hold together under the shock of her own guns firing, let alone under an enemy's fire returned. These doubts were not the idle chatter of the uninformed. They were shared, in more guarded language, by some of the very men responsible for the ship's construction, who understood better than anyone how much of what they were building rested on calculation rather than precedent. And so the work went forward at Blackwall beneath this quiet weight of unproven confidence, the furnaces burning, the hammers ringing, the iron rising slowly along its timber-lined frames. Watched by men who believed and men who doubted in equal measure, none of them yet able to say with certainty which of them time would prove correct. The hull that began to take shape along the Blackwall slipway belonged to no established category of vessel. It was not, in any strict sense, a wooden ship reproduced in a harder material. Though many at the time spoke of it that way, for want of a better description. It was something closer to a hybrid discipline, a marriage of the shipwright's inherited wisdom and the newer, less forgiving mathematics of the iron bridge builder. The men who drew her lines borrowed as much from the girder and the truss as they did from the keel and the rib. And this borrowing was not incidental, it was necessity. No one had built anything of this kind before, and so the engineers reached for whatever principles seemed to hold, regardless of where those principles had first been proven. The hull itself was constructed in a manner that would have been unrecognizable to a shipwright of only 20 years earlier. Instead of overlapping timbers fastened with wooden tree nails and iron bolts, the builders worked with iron plates, each one shaped, drilled, and set against its neighbor, then bound fast with rivets driven while glowing hot, so that as they cooled, they drew the plates together with a tightness no wooden joint could match. The riveting alone was a labor of staggering repetition. Thousands upon thousands of rivets were required, each one heated in a portable forge, carried by tongs to the waiting hole, hammered home by 2 or 3 men working in practiced rhythm, one holding, one striking, sometimes a third bracing the plate from the opposite side to absorb the shock. The sound of this work was said to have filled the yard from morning until dusk, a metallic percussion that never fully ceased, rising and falling as gangs moved from one section of the hull to another. Beneath this riveted iron skin lay a structural principle borrowed more from the bridge than the ship: watertight compartments, dividing the hull into a series of separate cells so that damage to any one section, whether from collision, storm, or the shot of an enemy gun, need not doom the vessel entire. This was not wholly without precedent in naval architecture, but never before had it been applied at such scale, nor with such rigor to a vessel of war. The compartments were framed in iron, braced and cross-braced, calculated to bear loads that no wooden hull could have withstood, and the builders understood, even as they worked, that they were constructing something closer to a floating iron cellular structure than to the layered wooden hulls their fathers and grandfathers had built. Whether this reasoning would hold under the actual violence of the sea, or worse, under the actual violence of battle, remained a question no drawing could answer. Only the ship herself, once built and once tested, could resolve it. It was in the armour that the ship's true departure from all precedent became most visible, and here the reasoning, though bold, was not reckless. The builders settled upon a belt of wrought iron some 4.5 inches in thickness, running along the ship's midsection where the machinery, the boilers, and the magazines lay most exposed to enemy fire. This iron belt was not left to stand alone. Behind it, forming a cushion between the armour and the ship's inner timbers, lay some 18 inches of solid teak, chosen for its density, its resistance to splintering, and its capacity to absorb the shock of impact without shattering into the deadly wooden fragments that had, in the age of wooden ships, so often proven more lethal than the shot itself. The logic of this layering was deliberate. Iron alone, struck hard enough, might crack or be driven inward in a single unyielding sheet, carrying its own fragments into the hull behind it. Teak alone offered no resistance at all to modern ordnance, but iron backed by teak, the engineers reasoned, might do what neither could do separately: absorb, distribute, and resist, layer working with layer. The hard face turned outward towards the enemy, the yielding mass held in reserve behind it. The placement of this armour was as considered as its composition. It did not run the length of the ship, for to armour her entire hull in iron of such thickness would have added a weight the vessel could not have carried, and still remained buoyant, swift, and seaworthy. Instead, the belt was concentrated where it mattered most, protecting the ship's vital organs, so to speak, while her bow and stern remained unarmoured, a compromise the builders accepted with the same quiet unease that attended every other decision of the design. It was a calculated exposure, made in the belief that a wound to the extremities, however unwelcome, would not prove fatal, while a wound to the heart of the ship certainly would. As the hull rose, plate upon plate, rib upon rib, the sheer scale of what was being built became impossible to ignore, even for those who passed the yard with no particular interest in ships or iron. She measured some 380 feet in length, a dimension that dwarfed anything then afloat in ordinary naval service, where the finest wooden line of battleships of only a decade before might have measured 240 feet from stem to stern. This new vessel exceeded them by nearly half again their length, and her breadth and depth followed the same expanding proportion. Her freeboard, the height of her hull above the waterline, rose higher than that of the wooden 2- and 3-deckers moored nearby in ordinary commission, so that when she was set beside them, even in her unfinished state, she appeared to belong to some later and larger age of the sea, a vessel that had wandered backward in time to keep uneasy company with ships she had already, in some sense, outgrown. It was this juxtaposition, more than any published dimension or engineer's report, that seemed to impress itself most forcibly on those who visited the yard. To stand at Blackwall and look from the rising iron hull to the wooden ships riding at anchor along the river was to understand, in a single glance, that something fundamental had shifted. The wooden ships, so recently the pride of the fleet, appeared suddenly modest, almost quaint, dwarfed not merely in length, but in the whole impression of mass and permanence that the iron hull conveyed even half-finished. Visitors who had come to satisfy simple curiosity often left instead with something closer to unease, a sense that they had witnessed the outline of a future in which much of what they had always understood about ships and war no longer applied. The labor of raising such a hull was, in its own right, an undertaking without close comparison in earlier shipbuilding practice. Cranes taller than any yet employed in ordinary shipyard work were erected along the slipway, their timber and iron frames groaning under loads of plate and beam that no wooden shipbuilding crane had ever been asked to bear. Scaffolding rose in tiers around the hull's growing flanks, a lattice of timber through which gangs of riveters, platers and labourers moved with the practiced caution of men who understood that a fall from such heights onto iron below offered little forgiveness. The plates themselves, some of considerable size and weight, had to be raised by block and tackle, guided into position by teams working in close coordination. Their movements shouted across the noise of hammers and forges, each plate set, checked, and only then riveted fast, the whole process repeated many thousands of times across the length and breadth of the ship. It was, above all, a labor of patience. There was no shortcut through the raising of an iron hull of this size. Each plate required its own measure of care, each rivet its own moment of heat and strike, and the men who performed this work did so knowing that a single flawed seam, discovered too late, might undo months of effort, or worse, prove fatal at sea. And beneath the visible labor of crane and forge lay the quieter labor of the mind, the constant checking and rechecking of calculations for which no ship had yet supplied a definitive answer. The builders at Blackwall were not merely assembling iron. They were testing, plate by plate and rivet by rivet, a theory of what a ship might now be, aware that the Royal Navy itself had never before required such a vessel, had never before staked so much upon a design so thoroughly unproven, and had never before asked its shipwrights to reason so far beyond the boundaries of everything they had previously known to be true. When at last she stood complete, and a visitor was permitted to walk her length from bow to stern, the first impression was not of any single feature, but of scale itself, a scale that seemed to announce itself quietly and then grow more insistent with every step taken along her decks. She measured some 380 feet in length, a figure that meant little spoken aloud, but became suddenly comprehensible when set beside the wooden two-deckers still riding at anchor nearby, vessels that had seemed enormous to a generation of sailors, and now appeared almost modest, almost toy-like, dwarfed by a hull that seemed to belong to some larger order of things entirely. Her beam approached 60 feet, wide enough that the deck itself felt less like the deck of a ship and more like a boulevard, a wide iron avenue running the length of a floating structure that displaced upward of 9,000 tons. A figure the shipwrights themselves repeated with a kind of quiet disbelief, as though saying the number often enough might make it easier to hold in the mind. Visitors who had spent their lives around wooden ships, who understood instinctively the proportions of oak and pine, found themselves oddly disoriented walking her decks, aware that the old instincts for judging a vessel's size no longer quite applied, that this was a different species of object requiring a different species of understanding, and that the disorientation itself was perhaps the truest evidence of what had been achieved at Blackwall. The armament, when it came into view, seemed at first almost restrained for a vessel of such size, and this restraint was itself deliberate, for the guns were not scattered along her length in the manner of the old wooden ships of the line, where cannon lined nearly every foot of hull from bow to stern. Instead, they were gathered, concentrated within a central armoured citadel amidships, a fortress within the fortress, where the thickest iron plating protected the ship's most vital organs and her most destructive instruments together. Within this citadel sat a battery of muzzle-loading guns, some of the heaviest yet placed aboard a British warship. Their bronze and iron barrels run out through ports cut into the armoured belt, so that a broadside fired from this gathered battery carried a weight of metal that would have seemed unthinkable only a decade before. The logic of the arrangement reflected a lesson only half learned, an acknowledgement that a ship might now need to protect her guns and her gunners as thoroughly as she protected her hull, that the age of the exposed gun deck, where sailors stood in ranks along an open broadside with only timber and courage between them and the enemy's iron, was passing even as this ship demonstrated why it must pass. Beyond the citadel, toward bow and stern, the unarmoured sections of hull remained more vulnerable, a compromise the designers had accepted rather than resolved, aware that armouring the entire length of so vast a hull lay beyond what iron and engineering of the day could reasonably supply. It was, in this sense, not a perfected answer, but a considered one, a vessel that admitted its own incompleteness, even as it advanced beyond everything that had come before it. Her propulsion told a similar story of a world caught between two ages, unwilling yet to abandon one entirely for the other. 3 masts rose from her deck, square-rigged and ready to carry canvas across an ocean crossing in the old manner. Sails that could drive her forward silently and without the appetite for coal that steam demanded. An appetite no navy of the day could fully satisfy across the vast distances its ships were expected to patrol. Yet below decks, and largely hidden from a casual glance along her upper works, sat the engines that marked her as something new, a steam plant driving a single screw propeller through the water, an arrangement that offered speed and maneuverability no sail alone could guarantee, particularly in the still airs or contrary winds that had frustrated naval commanders since ships first took to open water. The funnel that carried away her engine's smoke was built to telescope downward, retracting nearly flush with the deck when she sailed under canvas alone, so that the ship might present a cleaner profile to the wind and a lesser silhouette to any enemy who might otherwise judge her intentions from a distance. It was an elegant solution to an awkward problem, this folding away of the modern machinery to make room, however briefly, for the old rigging to do its work unimpeded, and it captured something of the ship's entire character, a vessel unwilling to fully commit to the future, while equally unable to remain content with the past. Life aboard such a ship required of her crew a discipline unlike anything demanded of sailors before them, for they were now expected to master two entirely different trades at once. The ancient art of rigging and canvas that had governed naval life for centuries, and the new and unfamiliar science of coal and steam that promised to replace it. Below the waterline, in spaces that grew stifling with heat whenever the engines ran, stokers fed coal into furnaces through long watches, their world reduced to shovel and firebox and the roar of forced draft. Their skin darkened with coal dust that no amount of scrubbing entirely removed. Their labor invisible to those who admired the ship from the harbor, but essential to every mile she steamed. Above them, in quarters that remained cramped despite the vessel's overall size, sailors slung hammocks in rows, much as their fathers had done aboard smaller wooden ships, sleeping within earshot of both the creak of rigging overhead and the distant thrum of machinery below. Two sounds that had rarely before been asked to coexist within a single vessel. The smell of coal smoke drifted through passageways that had once known only the scent of tar and salt water, mingling with the older, more familiar odors of a working ship, until the two became simply the smell of the vessel herself. Unremarkable to those who served aboard her, yet strange to any visitor from an older navy who came aboard expecting one world and found instead a blending of two. Officers were required to understand both trades sufficiently to command them, to read the set of a sail and the pressure gauge of a boiler with equal fluency, an education that no previous generation of naval officers had needed, and that marked those who served aboard her as pioneers of a kind. Whether they thought of themselves in such terms or not, the discipline required was not merely a matter of drill and order, but of a genuine intellectual adjustment, a willingness to hold two different understandings of what a ship was and how it moved, and to move between them without contradiction, several times within a single watch. To those who saw her from a distance, gliding into some harbor or riding at anchor among older vessels, the impression she gave was seldom described in the ordinary language reserved for ships. Witnesses reached instead for the language of fortification, calling her a floating fort, an iron castle set loose upon the water, as though the old shore batteries that had guarded harbors for centuries had somehow slipped their foundations and taken to the sea under their own power. Her black hull, unbroken by the rows of gun ports that had characterized wooden warships, gave her a solidity that seemed almost geological, less a constructed object than some dark outcropping given unlikely motion. Sailors from other navies, and there were many who came specifically to see her, spoke less of her guns or her speed than of this general impression of invulnerability. A sense that whatever weapon might be brought against her, she would simply absorb it and continue onward, indifferent, as a cliff face is indifferent to the waves that strike it. It was this impression, more than any single measurement of tonnage or armament, that would travel fastest across the naval powers of Europe, carried home by attachés and observers who struggled to describe in their reports something they had not quite possessed the vocabulary to anticipate. They had come expecting to see a large and heavily armed ship. They left instead with the unsettled sense of having witnessed the arrival of an entirely new category of object, one that made the whole vocabulary of naval power, so carefully assembled over centuries of wooden construction, suddenly and irreversibly obsolete. By December of that year, the hull that had drawn such attention while still resting in its cradle at Blackwall was ready, or as ready as careful men could make it, to meet the water for the first time. The date had not been chosen carelessly. Shipwrights who had spent their working lives beside the Thames understood that this stretch of river, for all its history of launches, had never been asked to receive a hull of this particular weight, this particular length, this particular unfamiliar material, pressing down through iron plate and frame rather than the buoyant, forgiving mass of oak. The tide tables were consulted and reconsulted. The river at Blackwall was not the open sea, it was a working channel, narrow by the standards of what now sat within it. bounded by wharves and moorings, and the ordinary traffic of barges and colliers that made their living on those waters. To slide so vast a hull down the ways and into a channel of finite width was to gamble that the calculations of buoyancy and momentum, worked out on paper by men who had never before been asked to solve for a ship of this scale, would hold true when tested against the real and unforgiving physics of iron meeting river. The morning of the launch gathered its own quiet drama before a single dogshore was knocked away. Crowds had begun arriving before first light, drawn by weeks of newspaper description, and by the simple, spreading word that something unprecedented was about to be attempted on the river. They came in numbers that surprised even the yard's own managers, filling the wharves, crowding onto the decks of moored vessels, climbing where they could find purchase along warehouse roofs and dockside cranes, all straining for a clear line of sight to the great dark shape resting in its cradle. Among them stood engineers and naval officers, shipwrights from rival yards who had come to see for themselves whether the boasts and drawings translated into something that could actually be trusted to the water, and ordinary Londoners who understood only that a ship unlike any other was about to be launched from their riverbank, and that this was a thing worth standing in the cold to witness. The technical anxiety of the moment was not showmanship. Those responsible for the launch understood, with the particular clarity of men whose reputations depended on the outcome, that a hull of this weight, moving down a slipway into a river this confined, represented a problem that traditional launching practice had not been designed to solve. Wooden ships, however large, had always possessed a certain forgiving buoyancy, a lightness relative to their bulk that made the transition from land to water a matter of established, well-practiced ritual. This hull carried within its iron plating and iron frames a mass that no timber ship of comparable length had ever approached, and the concern, quietly voiced among the engineers, though rarely committed to the newspapers, was whether the sheer momentum of that mass, gathered as it slid down the greased ways, might carry her too far, too fast, into a channel that offered comparatively little room to arrest her progress before she met the mud and moorings of the far bank. Every calculation of drag chains, of checking mechanisms, of the timing of the tide itself, had been made and remade in the weeks before, the arithmetic of a launch that had no exact precedent to draw upon. When the moment came, it came with the same understated ceremony that had marked so much of the ship's construction, though the crowd's attention gave it a weight no formal ritual could have added. The signal was given, the restraining timbers were knocked away in sequence, and for a breath that witnesses would later describe as impossibly long, nothing seemed to happen at all, the hull standing motionless as though the water itself were reluctant to receive so strange a guest. Then, with a groan that seemed to travel up through the wooden slipway and into the feet of everyone standing near enough to feel it, the great iron hull began to move. It gathered speed with a slow, deliberate inevitability, sliding down the greased ways toward the river with a sound unlike anything the assembled shipwrights had heard from a launch before, a low grinding note beneath the more familiar creak and crack of timber cradling, as though the ways themselves were straining to carry a weight for which they had not quite been built. The hull entered the water, not with the light, almost buoyant plunge of a wooden ship finding her natural element, but with something heavier, more deliberate, a vast displacement of river that sent water surging outward toward the crowded banks and rocking the smaller craft moored nearby with a wave that made more than one bargeman scramble for balance. For a moment, watched by thousands who had come specifically to see whether she would float true or founder in full view of the city, the hull settled low and dark against the grey December water, rocking gently as the checking chains did their work, and brought her forward motion to a halt within the confines of the channel. Then, gradually, she steadied. She rose, not dramatically, but with the quiet, settling correction of a vessel finding her designed waterline, until she sat upon the Thames precisely as her draftsman had promised she would. Low and long and dark, iron where the eye expected timber, and entirely unmistakably afloat. The reaction from the crowd, by the accounts that survive, was not the single great roar that popular memory often assigns to such moments, but something quieter and in its way more telling. A long exhalation, scattered applause rising and swelling only gradually into something more sustained, as though the onlookers themselves needed a moment to absorb what they had just watched before they could summon the appropriate noise for it. There was relief in it, certainly, the relief of engineers and shipwrights who had staked their professional standing on calculations, now vindicated by the plain evidence of a ship riding correctly on the water. But there was something else in that response too, a note that several observers tried to capture in the days afterward, and only partly succeeded in describing. A sense of having witnessed something that could not now be undone. Men who had spent their careers around wooden hulls, who understood timber and could read a ship's health in the sound of her working joints, stood on those Blackwall wharves watching an iron hull settle onto the river, and recognized, with whatever mixture of admiration and unease the recognition brought, that they had just watched their own trade begin its ending. That sense of irreversibility ran through nearly every account that survives from the day. It was not merely that a large ship had been successfully launched, an event that London's yards had managed many times before with vessels of considerable size and reputation. It was that the launch had demonstrated, in the plainest possible way, that iron construction at this scale was no longer a theoretical proposition confined to drawings and committee reports. She floated correctly, low in the water exactly as intended, riding the Thames with a settled confidence that put to rest, for any who had still harboured doubts, the question of whether iron could be trusted to do what wood had always done. For the shipwrights of the older tradition standing among the crowd that December morning, men whose fathers and grandfathers had learned their trade, shaping oak and elm into the wooden walls that had defended the nation for generations, the sight carried a particular weight. They had come, many of them, out of the same curiosity and professional wariness that had drawn naval attachés from across Europe, and they left with an understanding that the craft they had inherited and practiced and expected to pass on in turn had just been rendered, in a single unremarkable Thames morning, a thing of history rather than a thing of the future. There is a particular quiet that settles over a crowd once the immediate spectacle has passed, and the ordinary business of the day resumes around it. The barges once more finding their courses, the wharves clearing gradually as onlookers drifted back toward their working lives. But those who had stood at Blackwall that December carried something away with them beyond the memory of a successful launch. They carried the unshakable sense, however imperfectly they could articulate it at the time, that they had watched the closing of one age of shipbuilding and the opening of another, and that the river itself, indifferent as always to the ambitions of the men who used it, had simply accepted the new arrival and closed calmly over the wake of her passing, as though iron sliding into water were already, in that moment, an unremarkable fact of the world. The months that followed the launch belonged not to spectacle, but to labour of a quieter and more exacting kind. The long, unglamorous work of fitting out, in which a hull that had drawn crowds to the riverbank was towed to a mooring and surrounded once more by scaffolding, cranes, and the patient traffic of men carrying stores aboard. Warrior floated, but she was not yet a ship in any working sense, and the shipwrights and engineers who had raised her hull now turned to the slower business of making her whole. Boilers were lowered into her hold and set upon their beds. The great trunk engine, built to Penn's design, was assembled piece by piece within a space that seemed, to those who worked in it, more cavern than compartment, lit by lanterns that threw shifting light against iron plates still faintly scented of the yard. Rigging was set up mast by mast, the standing rigging tensioned by hand. The running rigging rove through blocks that had been carved and fitted by riggers whose trade, ironically, remained almost entirely unchanged by the revolution taking shape around them. Guns were swayed aboard and settled onto their carriages. Coal was loaded in quantities that dwarfed anything asked of a wooden ship, and stowed low against the ship's stability, a detail that mattered enormously to men whose calculations had to account for a hull whose behavior in a seaway was still, in truth, a matter of informed prediction rather than settled fact. Through the spring and into the summer of 1861, the work went forward without the drama of the launch, but with no less consequence, for it was here, in the fitting-out basin, that Warrior was translated from an engineering achievement into a working vessel of war. Officers assigned to her commissioning crew came aboard to inspect progress and left, according to accounts that survive, with an unfamiliar mixture of confidence and unease. For no serving officer of the Royal Navy had ever taken a ship like this to sea, and the manuals that governed seamanship offered little guidance for a hull sheathed in iron, powered by steam, and rigged as though she were still, in some essential way, a frigate of the old pattern. There was no body of experience to draw upon. Every trial that lay ahead would be, in the fullest sense, a first. When at last she was pronounced ready, in the late summer months, Warrior went out from the Thames for her sea trials, and it was here that the long months of quiet labour found their answer. The Admiralty had commissioned a ship of unprecedented size and unproven form, built from a material no one had used at this scale before, and there existed, among even her most confident advocates, a private uncertainty as to how she would actually behave once released from the calm waters of the river and set against open sea. The trials were conducted with the careful deliberation such uncertainty demanded, testing her first under steam alone, then under sail alone, then under the combination of both that her designers had intended as her ordinary working condition. The results, when they came, exceeded what many aboard had privately expected. Under steam, Warrior achieved speeds that startled her own officers, the ship's engines driving her through the water at a pace no wooden line of battleship, however handled, could hope to match. Contemporary accounts, drawn from the logs and correspondence of officers present at the trials, describe speeds approaching and, by some measurements, exceeding 14 knots, a figure that placed her not merely ahead of existing capital ships, but in a different category of vessel altogether. Under sail, she performed with more caution required, her draft and her iron mass making her handling under canvas alone a matter demanding careful seamanship. Yet even here she proved more capable than her critics had predicted, answering her helm with a steadiness that surprised officers accustomed to lighter, more nimble hulls. It was under steam and sail combined, however, that she revealed her fullest character, moving with a speed and a steadiness that belonged by every existing standard to a different order of ship than anything the Navy had commissioned before. The satisfaction this produced within the Admiralty was not loudly announced, for the culture of that institution did not favour open celebration, but it can be traced quietly through the tone of official correspondence and through the confidence with which further ironclads were subsequently ordered. A confidence that would have been difficult to justify had Warrior's trials produced anything less than the reassurance they in fact delivered. She had answered, in the space of a few weeks at sea, questions that engineers and admirals had debated for years in committee rooms and correspondence. Questions about whether iron could truly serve as a working material for a fighting ship, whether a hull of her size could be handled safely, whether the marriage of steam and sail in a vessel of this mass could be made to function as intended. The sea, in its unhurried way, had given its answer, and the answer was favourable. It was in these months, as word of her performance spread beyond the Navy itself, that one of the more vivid contemporary reactions to Warrior was recorded, attributed to a French naval officer who, upon observing her among the older wooden ships of a combined fleet exercise, is said to have described her as resembling a black snake among the rabbits. The image, however informal its origin, captures something that more measured official reports could only gesture toward. For it spoke to the visual shock of the thing as much as to any measurable statistic. The sight of this long, low, dark hull moving among ships, whose white sails and high wooden sides had defined the visible character of naval power for generations. Whether the officer's words were recorded with perfect accuracy or softened and sharpened in the retelling, as such quotations often are, the phrase endured because it named something true. The sense that Warrior did not merely outperform her wooden contemporaries, but appeared, even at rest, to belong to an entirely different species of vessel. Watchful and foreign among the older ships, she was soon to render obsolete. Her trials complete and her performance confirmed, Warrior was formally commissioned into the fleet in the closing months of 1861, an occasion marked with rather more ceremony than the working months of fitting out had allowed, though still restrained by the standards of a service that reserved its greatest formality for older and more familiar rites. She took her place among the assembled ships of the Channel Fleet, not as a curiosity to be admired from a respectful distance, but as a working vessel expected to stand her watches, exercise her guns, and take her turn in the ordinary rhythms of naval life. And it was in this quiet absorption into routine that the strangeness of her existence became, in a way, most apparent. Here was a ship built from a material no warship had used before, capable of speeds no line of battleship could match, carrying guns whose destructive power exceeded anything her wooden peers could bring to bear. And yet, she was expected to sail in company with them, to anchor beside them, to be treated for administrative purposes as simply one more ship among many. Officers and sailors who served alongside her in those early months left behind, in scattered letters and later recollections, a sense of the peculiar experience of standing on the deck of a wooden line of battleship and looking across the anchorage at Warrior's low black hull, riding among vessels whose form had scarcely changed since the age of Nelson. The contrast was not lost on them, nor was it lost on the wider public, for reports of her speed and her iron sides travelled quickly beyond naval circles and into the newspapers of the day, feeding a growing awareness, however imperfectly understood by those outside the service, that something fundamental had shifted in the character of naval power. She was, in this sense, both a working ship of the fleet and a kind of standing announcement, present at every anchorage she visited, of a change that would eventually touch every navy in the world. For now, in these first months of her commissioned life, she remained essentially unproven in the one respect that mattered most to the calculations of admiralties and the fears of rival powers, for she had not yet been tested in the one circumstance her existence was designed to answer. She had proven herself fast, seaworthy, and formidable in trial and exercise. Whether she could ever be made to prove herself in battle remained, for the time being, an open question, one that the diplomatic climate of the era would, as it happened, leave unanswered for the whole of her active career. To understand what Warrior meant, it helps to widen the view beyond her own deck, beyond the particular yard at Blackwall and the particular order that had summoned her into being, and to look instead at the long procession of vessels that had come before her and would follow after. For she did not stand alone in history so much as she stood at a hinge in it, a point where one very old story ended and another, still being written, began. The story that ended was one that had occupied shipwrights for centuries, a slow and patient escalation in the size and power of wooden warships, each generation adding a few more feet of length, a few more guns, a slightly higher freeboard, until by the middle of the 19th century, the ships of the line that dominated the world's navies had grown to a scale that would have astonished the builders of an earlier age. These were vessels of enormous complexity, floating cathedrals of oak and hemp and canvas, carrying anywhere from 70 to over 100 guns across multiple decks, crewed by companies that could number close to 1,000 men. They represented the accumulated craft of generations, a technology refined almost to its natural limit, for wood and rope and sail could only be pushed so far before the physics of the material itself began to resist further growth. A wooden hull of a certain length would begin to work and flex in a seaway in ways that threatened its own integrity. A mast of a certain height would strain the rigging beyond what rope and block could reliably bear. The wooden ship of the line by the 1850s had very nearly reached the ceiling of what wood could do, and the great navies of Britain and France had spent that decade building what were, in effect, the finest and largest examples of a design that had already gone as far as it could go. It was this quiet ceiling, more than any single dramatic event, that made the appearance of iron and steam so consequential. For these new technologies did not simply improve upon the wooden warship, they removed the ceiling altogether. Iron did not work and flex the way timber did. It could be built longer, stronger, and more resistant to shot, and it did not require the felling of ancient oak forests that were, by mid-century, growing scarcer across the timber yards of Europe. The pattern that had held for centuries, in which ships grew larger by increments measured in feet, was replaced almost overnight by a pattern in which they could grow by increments measured in entire orders of magnitude. And it was into this newly opened space that Warrior had been built, not merely as another entry in an old competition, but as the first entry in an entirely new one. France, as has already been told, had reached this threshold first, and it is worth pausing over the specific ways in which Gloire and Warrior differed, for the comparison illuminates something important about how two great naval powers approached the same problem from different assumptions. Gloire, launched in 1859, was in essence a wooden ship of the line, reimagined with an iron skin bolted onto her sides, her hull beneath the armour still built from timber in the old manner. Her design a hybrid that borrowed the strength of iron while retaining much of the familiar construction that French shipwrights already knew well. This approach had the advantage of speed. Gloire could be built quickly, using yards and skills the French Navy already possessed, and she entered service well before Warrior was ready. But the hybrid design carried a cost, for a wooden hull, however reinforced, could only be built so long before it began to flex, and this placed a natural limit on how large and how heavily armed a vessel of Gloire's type could become. Warrior answered this problem differently and more radically. Her hull was iron throughout, not timber clad in iron, and this distinction, seemingly technical, in fact opened an enormous gap between the two vessels, in terms of what each could ultimately achieve. An all-iron hull could be built longer, could carry heavier armament, and could achieve greater speed than a wooden hull ever could, however armoured its exterior. Warrior, at over 400 feet in length, dwarfed Gloire's 250-odd feet, and where the French ship's design represented the outer limit of what wood and iron construction could accomplish, Warrior's design represented the opening of a road that had, in principle, no such limit at all. The French had answered the question of iron armour first, but the British had answered a larger question, the question of what an iron ship itself could become. And it was this second answer that would prove, in time, the more consequential one. Yet it would be a mistake to see this simply as a British triumph over a French failure. For the two nations were locked, in these years, in the kind of anxious competition that has recurred throughout history whenever two rival powers sense that the balance between them is shifting. Each advance by one side provoked a corresponding advance by the other, not because either navy believed war was imminent, but because neither could afford to be left behind should it come. This pattern was not new to the Age of Iron. It echoed the arms races of earlier centuries, the contests between Tudor England and Habsburg Spain, between the ships of the line of Britain and France in the Age of Nelson. And it would recur again in later centuries in forms far more destructive. There is something in the nature of rival powers, when they possess the wealth and the industry to build such things, that makes restraint difficult and escalation almost automatic, each side telling itself that it is merely responding to the other, both sides together producing an outcome that neither, perhaps, would have chosen alone. Warrior and Gloire, in this sense, were less a story of one ship surpassing another than a story of two nations caught in a shared momentum, each glancing anxiously at what the other yard was building, each ordering more in response to what had already been ordered across the water. What is perhaps most striking, looking back across the century and a half since, is how quickly the wider world absorbed the lesson these two ships had taught. Within a remarkably short span of years, navies far beyond Britain and France began laying down their own iron and ironclad vessels. The United States, even as it was consumed by its own civil war, produced ironclads of very different design, low and turreted, built for the shallow waters of its rivers and coasts, rather than the open ocean crossings that Warrior had been built to command. Russia, Italy, Austria, and smaller naval powers besides, all began, in these years, to convert or construct ironclad vessels of their own, each adapting the underlying principle to its own waters, its own industry, its own strategic needs. What had seemed, in 1860, an almost unimaginable feat of engineering, a ship built entirely of iron and capable of crossing oceans under her own power, had become, within a single decade, the baseline expectation for any nation that wished to be considered a serious naval power at all. Warrior had not merely built a ship, she had, without any single dramatic proof of it in battle, settled an argument, and the world's navies had accepted her verdict with a speed that surprised even those who had built her. And yet, in one of the quieter ironies that history seems fond of producing, the very speed of this transformation meant that Warrior's own generation of ironclads was itself surpassed within remarkably little time. The ships that followed her through the 1860s and into the 1870s grew heavier armour, larger guns, and eventually turrets that could rotate independent of the broadside arrangement Warrior had inherited from centuries of sailing warfare. The very revolution she had inaugurated continued to accelerate past her, so that a vessel which had rendered every wooden warship in the world obsolete in a single year found herself, within a decade or so of her own launching, already beginning to look old-fashioned beside the newer iron ships being laid down in the very yards that had once laboured to build her. She had ended one age of naval warfare so decisively and so quickly that she had, in the process, hastened the beginning of the next one, a next age that would leave her own design behind almost as swiftly as she herself had left the wooden fleets behind. It was a fate common to nearly every vessel that has ever stood, however briefly, at the summit of naval technology, and Warrior, for all her singularity, would prove no exception to it. For the years that followed her trials, Warrior settled into a life that few who had watched her launch could have quite anticipated. A life measured not in battles fought, but in coastlines observed, harbours visited, and exercises completed in the company of other ships that had, in her wake, begun to take on iron hulls and iron ambitions of their own. She was assigned to the Channel Squadron, that collection of vessels charged with watching the narrow waters between Britain and the continent. And there she remained, for the most part, patrolling a stretch of sea that she could have crossed and recrossed in a single afternoon, had there been any urgent reason to do so. There rarely was. Her days took on the rhythm common to naval service in a period without war, a rhythm built from drills and inspections, from gunnery practice conducted against floating targets rather than enemy hulls, from the endless small maintenances that any ship, however revolutionary her construction, required to remain seaworthy. Her crew, numbering in the several hundreds, rose and slept by the same bells that had governed sailors for generations, climbed the same rigging, held the same watches, even as they did so aboard a vessel whose iron sides and steam engine set her apart from nearly everything that had come before. It was this very separation from the ordinary run of naval life that gave Warrior her particular value. A value that had little to do with the discharge of her guns and everything to do with the simple fact of her presence. She was, from the moment of her commissioning, understood by those who studied naval affairs to be the most powerful warship afloat, a status that required no demonstration in battle to be believed, since her mere existence had already been calculated, gun for gun and inch of armour for inch of armour, by every naval power with the means to make such calculations. Diplomats and admiralties across Europe had read the reports of her trials, had noted her speed and her armament and the thickness of her iron plating, and had drawn from those reports the conclusion that a war fought at sea against a nation possessing such a ship would be a war fought at a considerable disadvantage. This was, in its way, a form of power more complete than any victory achieved through combat, for it asked nothing of the ship beyond her continued existence, and it risked nothing, since a deterrent that is never tested can never fail. Warrior's actual service reflected this quiet, undemonstrative sort of importance. She sailed to the ports of the Mediterranean, where crowds gathered along the quays to view her, drawn by newspaper accounts of her size and her iron hull, and where foreign officers were invited aboard to inspect her guns and her engines. Inspections that served less as courtesies than as carefully managed demonstrations, intended to leave visiting powers with a clear and sobering sense of what British shipbuilding had achieved. She crossed to Portugal and to Gibraltar. She exercised with the rest of the Channel Squadron in manoeuvres meant to test the coordination of a fleet that now included, alongside the old wooden ships of the line still awaiting their retirement, an increasing number of her iron sisters. She served, for periods, as a flagship, carrying an admiral and his staff, and thereby becoming, for the duration of that appointment, the visible centre of whatever squadron she accompanied, the vessel toward which the eyes of onlookers and the guns of any hypothetical enemy would first be drawn. To serve as flagship aboard Warrior was to serve at what many considered the very pinnacle of naval prestige, and the officers who held that position understood themselves to be occupying a post of considerable honour, whatever the relative quiet of the tasks it actually required of them. The record of these years contains no engagement, no exchange of fire with a hostile vessel, no moment in which Warrior's guns were run out in anger and discharged against an enemy hull. She was built for war, and she never fought one, a fact that later generations would sometimes regard with a kind of wistful curiosity, as though a ship of such evident power ought somehow to have proven herself in the manner that ships had always proven themselves, through the smoke and wreckage of battle. But this expectation misunderstands the particular purpose that Warrior was built to serve. She had not been laid down to fight a war so much as to prevent one, or at least to ensure that if war came, Britain would enter it holding an advantage that no rival power could easily match. In this she succeeded entirely, and her success was measured precisely by the absence of any occasion requiring her to demonstrate it. The calm, undramatic decades of her active service, the patrols and exercises and diplomatic visits that filled her logbooks, were themselves the fulfillment of her purpose, however anticlimactic they might appear, beside the stories told of ships that had fought and burned and sunk. There is, in this, a paradox worth sitting with for a moment. The paradox of a vessel built at extraordinary cost, requiring the labour of thousands and the consumption of resources on a scale that few projects of the age could match, whose greatest achievement was to accomplish nothing at all in the way of combat, and to accomplish that nothing so completely that no rival power dared test her. The money spent upon her, the timber and iron gathered, the years of design and construction, all of it had been directed towards the creation of a weapon. And yet, the truest measure of that weapon's success lay not in destruction, but in restraint, not in the wreck of an enemy fleet, but in the simple, undisturbed passage of years during which no enemy fleet ever presented itself for her to engage. It is a strange kind of triumph, one that leaves behind no battle honors and no famous engagements, only a service record filled with the ordinary business of a peacetime navy. And yet it was, by the standards of those who had commissioned her, precisely the triumph they had sought. Even as Warrior continued her patrols and her exercises, the world that had produced her was already beginning to change around her, gradually and then with gathering speed, in ways that would eventually render her own remarkable design something closer to an early experiment than a lasting standard. New ships entered service in the years following her commissioning, ships that took the lessons of her construction and extended them further, adding heavier armor, adding guns of greater caliber, abandoning in time the masts and sails that Warrior still carried alongside her steam engine, as naval architects grew increasingly confident in the reliability of engines alone. Turret ships appeared, dispensing with the broadside arrangement of guns that Warrior had inherited from the age of sail in favor of armored turrets that could rotate to bring fire upon a target regardless of the vessel's heading. A development that addressed one of the more evident limitations of Warrior's own design. Where she had been the singular, unmatched giant of her launching year, she found herself, within a decade or so, one capable ship among a growing fleet of increasingly capable ships. Still formidable, still respected, but no longer without peer in the manner she had once been. This shift did not arrive as any single dramatic moment, but rather as a slow accumulation of newer vessels entering the Navy's lists, each one incorporating some improvement that Warrior herself lacked, until the cumulative weight of those improvements had quietly displaced her from the position of preeminence she had once held alone. She continued to serve, continued to be regarded as a valuable and powerful ship, continued to carry admirals and impress visiting dignitaries. But the particular status that had made her name a subject of anxious discussion in foreign admiralties gradually transferred itself to newer designs. Designs that owed their existence, in no small part, to the example she herself had set. It was, again, the common fate of vessels that stand briefly at the summit of naval technology, a fate she had herself imposed upon the wooden fleets she had rendered obsolete, and one she would now begin, slowly and without any particular drama, to experience in her turn, watching from her place in the Channel Squadron as the iron ships that followed her carried forward the revolution she had begun, leaving her, ship by ship and year by year, a little further behind. The years that followed her launch did not slow to allow her any rest upon her achievement. If anything, the pace of change quickened, as though the very fact of her existence had loosed something that could not be called back. Navies that had watched her trials with a mixture of alarm and admiration now set their own designers to work with an urgency that had not existed before. And the results came quickly. Where she had carried her iron in a single belt along her midships, later ships extended the armor further, thickened it where hers had been thin, and began to reconsider the whole question of where a ship's vulnerability truly lay. Where she had mounted her guns along the broadside in the old manner, inheriting the arrangement of centuries of sailing warships even as she abandoned their hulls, later designers broke with that inheritance entirely, placing guns instead in revolving turrets that could train upon a target regardless of the ship's own heading. It was a change that rendered the broadside arrangement, however heavily armored, however carefully conceived, into something already halfway to obsolete, a solution to a problem that the turret solved more completely. Nor did the changes stop with armor and armament. The iron hull itself, which had seemed so radical a departure when she was laid down, gave way within a decade or two to hulls of steel, a material stronger for its weight, allowing designers to build ships that carried more armor, more armament, more machinery, without growing unmanageably heavy in the process. Engines improved, boilers improved. The compound engine gave way to still more efficient designs, and the ships that emerged from this accelerating sequence of improvements could steam faster, strike harder, and endure more punishment than she had ever been built to withstand. It was not that any single innovation rendered her obsolete in a single stroke. It was rather that the innovations arrived one upon another, each one modest in isolation, each one part of a cumulative transformation that left her, within a remarkably short span of years, no longer at the summit she had once occupied so completely. She did not become useless. This is worth saying plainly, because the easy version of her story, the version that flattens complexity into a single dramatic arc, would have her leap from triumph to irrelevance in the space of a sentence, and this was not how it happened. She remained for a long while yet a capable ship, her armor still thick enough to matter, her guns still heavy enough to threaten anything but the very newest of her rivals, her hull still sound, her engines still turning. She served in the Channel Squadron for years, taking her place among the fleet's frontline vessels, exercising, training, showing the flag, doing the ordinary work of a warship in a time of uneasy peace. The record does not suggest she was regarded, even in this period, as anything less than a serious ship. But serious was no longer the same as supreme, and the distance between the two, small at first, widened with each new vessel launched by each rival yard. There is a particular melancholy in this kind of decline, one that differs from the sudden loss of a ship in battle or storm. A ship destroyed retains, in memory at least, the shape of her prime. She does not live to be compared, year after year, against successors that surpass her. But a ship that survives her own moment of supremacy is condemned to a slower and more visible diminishment, watched not only by historians looking back, but by her own officers and crew, who could read in the newspapers and the naval lists the specifications of ships being laid down elsewhere, ships with thicker belts, heavier guns, faster engines, and understand, without needing to be told, what this meant for the vessel beneath their own feet. To serve aboard her in these years was to serve aboard a ship that had been, within living memory, the most powerful thing afloat, and to know that this was no longer true and would become less true with each passing season. The record of her later active service reflects this gradual eclipse. She continued in frontline duty for a time, but the assignments grew less central, the postings less prestigious, as newer ships took the places of honor in the great reviews and the great squadrons. Eventually, in the natural course of a fleet's renewal, she was moved from active frontline service into reserve, the status given to ships still sound and still capable, but no longer required for the first tier of the nation's naval strength. It was not a dishonorable posting, and reserve status did not mean idleness. Ships in reserve were maintained, exercised periodically, kept ready for a return to active duty should circumstances demand it. But it was, unmistakably, a step down from what she had once represented. A quiet acknowledgement made through administrative reassignment, rather than through any public declaration, that she was no longer the ship the nation needed to rely upon first. There is something almost lawful in this pattern, something that recurs across the history of pioneering vessels with a regularity that borders on the poetic. A ship built to be unbeatable is, by the very act of its construction, a spur to those who would beat it. The nations that had trembled at her example did not respond by abandoning the contest. They responded by building their own answers, and those answers, arriving within a generation, rendered the original marvel into merely one ship among many. and then into an aging ship among many newer ones. It had happened to the wooden fleets she herself had rendered obsolete in a single winter, and now it was happening to her, following the same pattern, moving at the same inexorable pace, indifferent to the fact that she had once been the instrument of this very obsolescence for others. The ship that ends an age is rarely permitted to preside over the next one. She does her work, forces the world to change around her, and is then quietly absorbed into the changed world she made possible, no longer exceptional within it. In time, as her front-line usefulness continued to fade, she was given over to duties further still from the role for which she had been built. She was fitted in due course for training purposes, her decks and her machinery serving to instruct new generations of sailors and engineers in tasks that had nothing to do with the line of battle for which she had originally been conceived. Her guns, once the most formidable broadside afloat, were altered or removed as her role changed, her rigging modified to suit duties that no longer required the sail power that had once supplemented her steam. She became, in these years, less a warship in the fullest sense and more a floating institution, a hull that housed instruction and administration. Her Ironsides still sound, still capable of keeping out the sea, but no longer required to keep out an enemy's shot. Depot duties followed, the unglamorous work of supporting a fleet's logistics and training rather than standing in its front line. And she performed this work as she had performed her earlier duties, without complaint, without ceremony, simply continuing to exist and to be useful in whatever form usefulness now took. There is a particular quality to a great ship settling into this kind of quieter life, a quality that those who study the long histories of pioneering vessels have often remarked upon. The hull that once dwarfed every other in the fleet, that once caused such disquiet among rival nations, continues all these years later to sit at her moorings, still recognizably herself, still built to the proportions and the specifications that had made her so remarkable in her prime, and yet transformed by circumstance into something far more modest than what she had been. She was not destroyed. She was not, in these years, even particularly diminished in any material sense. Her iron did not rust away. Her frame did not weaken beyond use. What changed was not the ship, but the world around her. A world that had moved on to newer marvels and left her, structurally intact but functionally superseded, to serve out her years in tasks that asked far less of her than she had once been capable of giving. It is a melancholy fate, though not a tragic one, the fate of a revolutionary vessel settling, by degrees and without any single dramatic turning point, into the slower rhythms of a ship whose great work has already been done. The years that followed her withdrawal from active service asked little of her beyond a willingness to remain afloat and to hold whatever was placed within her. She became, in the manner of many great ships whose fighting days have ended, a kind of vessel of convenience, a hull too sound to break up and too outdated to arm, and so she was given over to purposes that had nothing to do with the ambitions that had brought her into being. For a time she served as a floating base, her decks host to depot duties and her holds given to storage. The great engines that had once driven her through the channel, now silent or removed altogether. The space they had occupied filled instead with the ordinary clutter of naval administration. Officers who walked her decks in those years likely gave little thought to the fact that they stood upon what had once been the most closely watched ship in the world, the vessel whose iron sides had rendered every wooden navy in existence obsolete within the span of a single commissioning. To them she was simply a base, a hull that floated and held stores, distinguished from 100 other such hulls chiefly by her size and by the antique elegance of a design that belonged unmistakably to an earlier decade. The fittings that had once made her a warship were stripped away with the same lack of ceremony that had accompanied every other stage of her decline. The guns had gone first, redistributed or scrapped as her armament became a curiosity rather than a threat. The rigging that had once carried her sails, already an anachronism by the time she was launched, had long since been reduced and finally removed, until the tall masts that had given her the silhouette of a ship still tethered to the age of sail stood no longer, and she took on the lower, plainer profile of a working hull with no pretensions left to keep. Her interior spaces, once fitted with the careful attention that had gone into balancing tradition and innovation, were reconfigured piece by piece into whatever arrangement current usage required. The wardroom paneling, the officers' quarters, the neat rows of mess tables where sailors had once eaten within sight of both a Rambo and a full spread of canvas, gave way over time to storage racks and administrative offices. The ship's grand original purpose receding a little further with each alteration. None of this was done with any evident awareness that something significant was being erased. It was simply the ordinary business of keeping an old hull useful, performed by men who saw a ship in need of a function, not a monument in need of preservation. Eventually, she was moved to Pembroke Dock on the Welsh coast, where her service took its most reduced and most quietly poignant form. There she was moored as a floating oil jetty, her iron hull put to work not as a vessel that moved through the water under her own power and purpose, but as a stationary platform, a fixed point to which fuel lines could be attached and tankers brought alongside. It is difficult to conceive of a role more distant from the one for which she had been built. The ship that had once been designed to outpace and outgun anything afloat, whose speed and armour had made her the single most consequential naval asset in the world. For a brief span of years, now sat motionless at her moorings, valued only for the volume of oil that could be pumped through pipes laid across her deck. She had become infrastructure. Her iron sides, still as sound as they had been the day she was launched, held together not a fighting ship but a fuel depot, and the men who worked around her in those years, handling hoses and gauges, likely knew her only by whatever name or number she had been assigned for that duty, with little cause to inquire into the history of the hull beneath their feet. It is worth pausing on this fact that a ship of such singular historical importance could pass through the hands of a working dockyard population largely unrecognized for what she was. There is no record of ceremony attending her arrival at Pembroke Dock, no plaque affixed to mark the presence of the vessel that had ended an entire age of naval construction. She was simply another hull pressed into service for a task that required a floating platform and asked nothing more of it than buoyancy and a flat expanse of deck. The workers who moved along her sides, connecting and disconnecting fuel lines, would have seen an old iron ship, evidently venerable in construction, evidently built to a design no longer in fashion, but not necessarily understood as the object that had once absorbed the anxious attention of an entire nation's admiralty and the rival ambitions of a continental power. History, in this instance, moved past her not through destruction, but through indifference, the sort of forgetting that requires no dramatic act, only the passage of time and the natural tendency of the present to occupy itself with present concerns. The decades themselves left their marks in the manner decades always do upon things left standing without active care. Paint that had once been applied with the pride due a flagship peeled and flaked under the salt air, leaving patches of bare iron exposed to the weather. What machinery remained aboard her, no longer required for any active duty, was gradually removed, piece by piece, whenever some other vessel or shore installation had need of parts that could be salvaged from an obsolete hull. Rust found its way into corners and fittings, particularly wherever paint had failed, and iron met the damp Welsh air directly. Though the underlying structure of her hull, built with the care and redundancy of a design meant to survive contact with enemy shot, resisted the kind of deep structural decay that might otherwise have doomed a lesser vessel decades earlier. This was, in its way, the last vindication of her original construction. She had been built to endure far more violent stresses than the slow erosion of weather and neglect, and so she endured that lesser trial with relative ease, her frame holding firm even as everything that had made her a warship, a symbol, a source of anxious pride and anxious fear, was worn away or carried off piece by piece. There is no single moment in this long decline that can be pointed to as the ship's true ending. No dramatic scuttling, no final battle, no ceremonial decommissioning attended by dignitaries and bands. This is itself a kind of historical lesson, quietly instructive in its own right. Ships of great consequence do not always meet ends commensurate with the significance of their beginnings. Some are broken up formally, mourned by naval societies and remembered in ceremony. Others, like this one, simply persist past the point of relevance, absorbed into ever more modest duties until the line between ship and infrastructure blurs entirely, and the vessel that changed the course of naval architecture becomes, in the eyes of those who pass it daily, indistinguishable from any other aging piece of harbour equipment. The absence of ceremony was not a failure of respect so much as a simple consequence of time's ordinary workings. The way significance fades not through any deliberate erasure, but through the accumulation of years in which no one thought to ask what, precisely, they were looking at. By the time her working life as an oil jetty had run its course, she had been reduced, in the eyes of the world, to a rusting hulk at anchor, valued for whatever remaining utility her hull could offer and otherwise unremarked upon. The battleships that had followed her, vessels of steel and turret and ever-increasing displacement, had themselves come and gone through their own cycles of service and obsolescence, each generation of naval power rendering the last redundant in turn, just as she herself had once rendered every wooden ship of the line obsolete within the span of a single commissioning. The world had moved on many times over since her launch, through steel hulls and turreted guns, and eventually through vessels she would scarcely have recognized as ships at all. And she remained, through all of it, quietly at her moorings, an iron shape against the grey water of the dock. Her name known to a diminishing few, her history folded away into archives that few thought to consult, her hull rusting gently in the salt air while the century that had once watched her, every movement with such anxious fascination, continued on, indifferent, toward its own unknown ends. For the better part of a century, the ship that had once been the most watched vessel in the world existed almost entirely unwatched. She was known at Pembroke Dock by a name that had nothing to do with her past, called Oil Fuel Hulk, C-77 in the ledgers of the Admiralty, her decks plated over, her masts long gone, her original lines buried beneath layers of iron sheeting and timber cladding, added for her working life as a floating depot. Sailors who serviced her knew only that she was old, that her hull seemed unusually deep and unusually solid for a vessel of her apparent purpose, and that something about her proportions did not quite match the utilitarian craft she had become. Few among them thought to ask why. The record of her true identity had not vanished from the world entirely, but it had receded into a handful of specialist references, naval historians' footnotes, and the fading memory of a small number of officers who had once served aboard her under her original name before she was stripped for fuel storage. For most who walked her decks in the middle of the 20th century, she was simply Hulk C-77, an old iron shell doing useful, unglamorous work, and nothing more. The slow realization that this hulk was in fact Warrior did not arrive as a single discovery, but accumulated gradually, the way most historical recoveries do, through the patient cross-referencing of documents by people who had begun to suspect that something significant lay beneath the fuel tanks and cladding. Naval historians researching the Ironclad era in the middle decades of the century began to notice discrepancies in the official disposal records. Ships listed as broken up, whose fates seemed insufficiently documented. Hulls whose end had been recorded in bureaucratic shorthand without the accompanying paper trail one would expect for a vessel of such former significance. Cross-checking against Admiralty survey reports, engineering assessments, and hull dimensions preserved in old technical drawings, a small number of researchers began to conclude, independently and then in correspondence with one another, that the fuel hulk moored at Pembroke Dock bore the unmistakable dimensions and structural signatures of the Ironclad that had once dominated the fleet reviews at Spithead. It was, they concluded with growing confidence through the 1950s and 60s, no ordinary conversion. It was Warrior herself, altered almost beyond recognition, but never actually destroyed. The confirmation, once it spread among naval historians and enthusiasts of maritime heritage, produced a quiet but insistent movement to see the ship preserved. This was not, at first, a popular or well-funded cause. Britain in the post-war decades had other priorities, and a rusting fuel hulk, however historically significant its underlying structure, competed poorly against a great many demands on limited resources for heritage and restoration. Naval architecture enthusiasts and a handful of dedicated historians argued the case in journals and letters to the Admiralty, pointing out that here, uniquely, survived the actual hull of the ship that had inaugurated the ironclad age. Not a replica, not a model, but the very iron plates that had once made every wooden warship in the world instantly and irreversibly obsolete. The argument was not universally persuasive. Some in naval circles, and in the broader heritage establishment, questioned whether a vessel altered as extensively as this one. Stripped of her original armament, her masts, her Victorian fittings, and reconfigured almost beyond recognition for decades of utilitarian service, could truly be said to retain historical significance. What, after all, remained of Warrior in a hull plated over for fuel storage, its guns removed, its engines long silent, its very silhouette transformed by decades of practical modification? Was this preservation of history, or merely sentimental attachment to an iron shape that happened to share a keel with something once important? The debate, carried on through the 1960s into the following decade, gradually turned in favor of preservation, driven by a combination of persistent advocacy, a broader cultural turn toward valuing industrial and maritime heritage, and the simple, stubborn fact that the hull, whatever had been done to it above the waterline, remained substantially intact below. Engineering surveys conducted as the preservation case gathered momentum confirmed that the wrought iron plating and the innovative hull construction that had made Warrior revolutionary in 1861 had survived remarkably well, protected in part by the very conversion work that critics cited as evidence of the ship's compromised authenticity. The cladding and fuel tank additions had, in an irony not lost on the surveyors, helped preserve the original iron beneath from the corrosive effects of decades of exposure. What had seemed to some an argument against her significance turned out, on closer examination, to be part of what had kept her recoverable at all. By the middle of the 1970s, a formal restoration project had been organized, backed by a trust established specifically for the purpose and supported by naval and heritage bodies, persuaded that the ship represented something genuinely irreplaceable. The vessel was towed from Pembroke Dock to Hartlepool, where a shipyard with the appropriate facilities undertook what would become one of the most extensive maritime restoration projects of the century. The work, once begun, proved to be a longer and more demanding undertaking than early estimates had suggested, stretching across the better part of a decade as the restoration team confronted the challenge of returning a heavily modified 20th century fuel hulk to something resembling her original 1861 configuration. A task that involved not merely repair, but a form of historical reconstruction, piecing together how the ship had once looked and functioned from a combination of surviving drawings, archival photographs, contemporary accounts, and the physical evidence embedded in the hull itself. This reconstruction demanded genuine historical and archaeological research alongside the shipbuilding work. Original builders' plans, where they survived in Admiralty and Thames Ironworks archives, were consulted to determine the exact configuration of decks, fittings, and rigging that had been stripped away over decades of naval service and subsequent conversion. Where plans were incomplete or ambiguous, researchers turned to period photographs, ship's logs, and the accounts of officers and visitors who had described her interior in the years immediately following her commissioning, cross-referencing these fragmentary sources to resolve questions about the placement of guns, the arrangement of the officers' quarters, the detail of the ship's decorative work, and the configuration of the engine room machinery that had once represented the most advanced marine engineering in the world. Craftsmen skilled in traditional shipwriting techniques, joinery, and metalwork were brought in specifically because the restoration required methods and materials appropriate to the Victorian period, rather than modern shortcuts. A decision that added years to the project, but was considered essential if the finished ship was to represent something more than a modern approximation dressed in old form. Masts were stepped again according to the original rigging plans. Guns, reconstructed to the specifications of the original armament, were remounted along the gun deck. The great funnel and the auxiliary sailing rig were rebuilt in proportion to the ship's original silhouette. The balance between steam and sail that had made her such a striking hybrid of two eras restored to visible form. The restoration, when it was finally completed in the early 1980s, represented one of the most thorough returns of a historic warship to her original condition ever undertaken. A project that had drawn on naval archives, structural surveys, and traditional craftsmanship in roughly equal measure. What emerged from the Hartlepool yard bore little resemblance to the fuel hulk that had sat largely forgotten at Pembroke Dock for decades. She was, once again, recognizably the ship that had astonished observers at Blackwall in 1860 and that had ridden at anchor amid the wooden fleet at Spithead. Her black hull and white upperworks restored, her rigging raised, her guns returned to their positions along the deck where they had once represented an unanswerable argument in iron. In 1987, restored and renamed once more to her original identity, she was brought to Portsmouth, and there she was opened to the public as a museum ship, moored within sight of the very historic dockyard that held Nelson's Victory, the wooden flagship whose era Warrior had brought to its quiet, irreversible close more than a century before. The two ships now lay within a short walk of one another, the old wooden order and the iron future that had replaced it, standing together at the same dockyard as if the intervening century of transformation could be measured simply by walking the short distance between their berths. One shape of naval power giving way, slowly and without a single battle, to the other. Historians who study the transition from wood to iron have, over the years that followed her restoration, settled on Warrior as a convenient marker for something that was never as clean in practice as it appears in retrospect. It is tempting, and not entirely wrong, to say that naval history divides neatly into a before and an after, with her launch standing as the line between them. But those who have studied the archives most closely tend to speak more carefully than that. The wooden warship did not end in a single afternoon on the Thames, nor even in the years immediately following her commissioning. It ended gradually in committee rooms and dockyards across several nations, as admiralties absorbed what her existence meant and adjusted their building programs accordingly. Warrior did not so much end an age as announce, with unusual clarity, that the age was already ending, and that anyone who wished to remain a naval power would need to follow where she pointed. The distinction matters to historians, even if it makes for a less tidy story, because it locates her significance correctly. She was not a single blow that felled an old order. She was the clearest evidence yet produced that the old order could not survive. Evidence so decisive that no admiralty could reasonably argue otherwise once she lay finished in the water. This is, in its way, a more interesting kind of significance than the version that circulates in simpler accounts of her story. A ship that won a great battle earns her place in memory through a single afternoon of violence, however costly. Warrior earned her place by making a certain kind of violence obsolete before it could occur, by rendering entire classes of warship unable to safely engage her, and, by extension, unable to safely engage whatever came after her. Her power lay in what she prevented rather than what she did, in the battles that were never fought because no captain foolish enough to fight them existed. Historians have long noted that this makes her a difficult subject for popular retelling, since there is no engagement to narrate, no moment of crisis to build toward. Only the slow accumulation of understanding among naval planners that the old wooden ships of the line, however handsome, however storied, could no longer be risked against her. That understanding did not arrive as drama. It arrived as policy, as revised building schedules, as quiet decisions in admiralty offices to lay down iron rather than oak. The revolution she represented was real, but it was administrative and gradual in its unfolding, which is perhaps why her story rests so easily alongside those of ships that fought and sank, without needing a battle of her own to justify the comparison. The question of how revolutionary she truly was, compared to Gloire, has occupied naval historians for longer than either ship existed, and it remains, even now, a debate conducted with more nuance than certainty. The French case rests on priority. Gloire was conceived first, launched first, and forced the British hand in the first place, and no history of Warrior can honestly be written without acknowledging that she was, in the most literal sense, a response. Without Gloire, there might have been no Warrior, or at least not one built with such urgency. The British case rests on completeness. Warrior was iron through her structure rather than iron laid over wood, faster under both sail and steam, longer, and armed with guns that could reach further and strike harder than anything Gloire carried. Historians who favour the French ship point out that revolutions are often begun by the first mover, whatever refinements follow. Historians who favour the British ship point out that a design fully realised in iron represents a more complete break with the old shipbuilding tradition than a wooden hull merely clad in armour plate, however innovative that cladding was for its time. Neither position has won the argument outright, and the more careful scholarly accounts tend to resist declaring a winner at all, preferring instead to describe the two ships as partners in a single transformation, each answering the other, each pushing forward a change that neither alone would have completed so quickly. It is a debate without a villain and largely without a hero, a disagreement conducted in the patient language of naval architecture rather than the language of national pride, though echoes of that older rivalry can still be heard, faintly, in how each country's historians tend to tell the story. What is not disputed by anyone who has examined the record closely is that Warrior worked as intended for as long as she was needed, and that her working was itself a kind of achievement distinct from combat. A deterrent succeeds precisely by producing an absence of war, an absence of the engagements her design made unwinnable for any opponent then afloat. This is a strange thing to celebrate, since celebration usually attaches to events, and an absence is not an event. But naval historians have increasingly come to regard the peace she helped preserve, however contested and however temporary, as an accomplishment in its own right, one that deserves the same careful attention given to more dramatic naval careers. A ship that prevents a war does something a ship that wins one cannot. She leaves nothing to mourn. There were no crews lost aboard Warrior in battle, no wrecks to be located later on some seabed. No memorial services held for men who died aboard her under fire. Her entire service record consists of readiness maintained and never tested, patrols conducted and nothing engaged, guns kept prepared and never fired at another vessel. It is a peculiar kind of naval biography, and one that resists the ordinary rhythms of maritime storytelling. Yet it is no less real for its quietness. Today she rests at Portsmouth, preserved as a museum ship, her iron hull maintained by conservators who understand her as clearly as any group of specialists has ever understood a 19th century warship. Visitors come in modest numbers compared to those who queue for Nelson's flagship nearby, and this seems, in a way, appropriate to her character. She was never the ship of legend that victory became, never the setting for a famous death or a famous victory, and so she draws a different kind of visitor: the curious, the historically minded, those who have read enough naval history to understand what she represents, and who come specifically to see the hinge point of an era rather than the site of a battle. They walk her lower decks, past the great guns that were never fired in anger, past the engine spaces where her machines once produced more force than any warship afloat had commanded before her. And they come away, most of them, with a quieter understanding of naval power than the one they arrived with. Not every important ship needs to have sunk something. Some ships change history simply by existing, by being finished and floated and reported upon, and by making every alternative to themselves instantly outdated. There is a strange dignity in this, one that becomes more apparent the longer one considers her case. Warrior never fought a battle, never exchanged fire with an enemy vessel, never lost a man to combat in all her years of active service. And yet she altered the course of naval history more thoroughly and more permanently than nearly any ship that did fight, anywhere, in any century. Ships that win battles are remembered for the battles. Ships that end eras are remembered, when they are remembered at all, for something harder to picture and easier to overlook. The moment when an entire category of vessel, in this case the wooden ship of the line that had dominated naval warfare for centuries, simply stopped being built, stopped being relevant, stopped being worth the enormous cost of construction, because something like Warrior now existed and made them obsolete on sight. She rests now within sight of victory, the two hulls separated by no more than a short walk across the historic dockyard at Portsmouth. One wooden and storied, carrying the memory of a battle fought and a death mourned. The other iron and comparatively unadorned by drama, carrying instead the quieter memory of an age that ended without a single shot fired to mark its passing. Visitors can stand at a point between them and see both at once: the great wooden hull with its towering masts and gilded stern, and beyond it the low, dark iron shape that made such wooden ships unbuildable, unusable, and finally unthinkable as instruments of serious naval power. More than a century separates their commissioning, yet the walk between their berths takes only a few minutes, as if the entire transformation of naval warfare, the whole slow turning from timber to iron that took decades to complete in fact, could be measured, standing there in the salt air of the dockyard, in the simple distance between two ships moored quietly, side by side, at rest. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself with conquest or bloodshed, but with steel and rivets, with the quiet arithmetic of tonnage and horsepower, with the simple, overwhelming fact of a hull no rival power could match. Warrior was built for no war. She fired no shots in anger, chased no enemy across open water, and yet she may have been one of the most consequential ships ever laid down, precisely because of what she made unnecessary. She was designed to end arguments before they began, to make certain calculations so obviously unfavorable to any adversary that the calculations themselves were never attempted. This is a strange kind of greatness, one built entirely on restraint, on the silent persuasion of iron sitting at anchor. The men who ordered her built, the engineers who drew her lines, the ironworkers who riveted her plates through long Thames winters, were not preparing for a battle they expected to fight. They were building a sentence in a language that required no translation, a statement so complete in itself that it foreclosed the need for reply. It is worth pausing, in these final moments of her story, on what that ambition actually cost, and what it meant to gamble so heavily on a ship whose purpose was to never be tested. The bill for Warrior was immense by the standards of her age, a sum that could have built a small fleet of conventional wooden ships of the line, vessels whose value in battle was proven across centuries of use. Instead, that treasure went into an unproven design, into iron plating whose behavior under sustained bombardment was still a matter of committee reports and dockyard experiments, into engines whose reliability was measured in weeks rather than decades of service. There was no guarantee, when the keel was laid, that the hull would hold together at sea, that the iron would not crack in cold water, that the great weight above the waterline would not roll her over in a heavy swell. The Admiralty gambled a fortune and a considerable measure of national prestige on a design that existed nowhere else in the world, built on principles worked out on paper and tested, in the end, only by the ship herself. And yet the gamble paid its dividend in a currency stranger than victory. Warrior fought no engagements, sank no enemy vessels, rescued no besieged garrison. Her entire service life, extended and useful as it was, produced no single decisive moment that historians can point to and say, "Here, this is why she mattered." Her importance lies instead in the negative space around her, in the wars that were not fought because of what she represented, in the naval budgets of rival powers that had to be entirely reimagined once her existence became known, in the slow, grinding realization among French naval planners that the wooden fleet they had spent generations perfecting was now, in a single stroke, made obsolete. This is the quiet cost of ambition on this scale. Vast sums spent, uncertain engineering trusted, an entire ship built and maintained and crewed for a war that, in the end, never came. Whether this represents waste or wisdom depends entirely on how one weighs the value of a war avoided against the value of a war decisively won. Warrior offers no easy answer to that question. She simply sits in the historical record as proof that the calculation was made, and made in Britain's favour, and that the world adjusted itself accordingly without a single shot needing to be fired from her guns. Standing back from the details of her construction and her service, there is a longer lineage worth considering, one that stretches back through centuries of shipwrights working in wood, generation after generation, refining hull shapes and rigging plans through accumulated trial and inherited skill. A craft passed from master to apprentice in yards not so different from the one at Blackwall, where Warrior herself was built. That lineage produced ships of extraordinary beauty and considerable capability, vessels whose oak frames and towering canvas represented the absolute limit of what timber and rope and human ingenuity could achieve upon the water. Warrior stands at the furthest edge of that lineage, the last ship built when wood was still assumed to be the answer, and simultaneously the first ship built when iron announced itself as a wholly different question. She is both ending and beginning, both the final elaboration of an old certainty and the opening sentence of a new one. And there is something worth sitting with in the fact that these two roles occupied the same hull, the same yard, the same year of construction. The shipwrights who worked alongside the ironworkers on her frame were, whether they understood it fully or not, present at the closing of one age and the opening of another, their hands moving between materials that would soon belong to entirely separate trades, separate skills, separate futures. It is this doubled nature that makes Warrior such an unusual subject for reflection. More unusual in some ways than ships that fought famous battles or met dramatic ends. She asks the observer to hold two facts in mind at once: that she was built to make war unnecessary, and that the very act of building her rendered an entire prior world of naval architecture, an entire tradition of wooden shipbuilding stretching back through the age of sail, essentially finished. There is no triumph in this without a corresponding loss, no advance in engineering without the quiet retirement of skills and yards and traditions that had taken centuries to perfect. Somewhere in the yards of Britain and France, wooden shipwrights who had spent their working lives mastering the particular curve of an oak frame or the precise tension of standing rigging found their trade, almost overnight by the standards of craft traditions, transformed into something increasingly ornamental, a skill still practiced, but no longer central to naval power. Warrior did not intend this loss. She was simply the instrument through which it occurred, the visible proof that iron could do what wood no longer could, and the navies of the world adjusted their ambitions accordingly, mourning, if they mourned at all, only in the quiet closure of yards that had built ships for generations and would now build them no more. And so the story returns in its final image to where it began, to a ship resting quietly at anchor, her iron hull unchanged by the passing of more than a century and a half, her lines still recognizable as the lines drawn in that first design competition so long ago. Around her, everything has been transformed by what she began. The harbour itself has changed, filled now with vessels built from steel that owes its lineage directly to the iron plating riveted onto her sides at Blackwall, powered by engines descended in principle from the ones that once turned her single screw. She sits among the descendants of her own revolution, a grandmother ship surrounded by grandchildren she could scarcely have imagined, and yet her presence there is not diminished by their existence. If anything, it is clarified by it. She is the reason they exist in their present form, the reason naval architecture took the turn it did, the reason wood gave way so completely and so quickly to iron and then to steel. She remains, patient and dark and low in the water, the point of departure for everything that followed. There is comfort, perhaps, in ending here with a ship that changed everything by threatening nothing, that earned her place in history not through violence, but through the sheer, undeniable fact of her existence. If you have found some measure of that quiet reverence in her story, more great ships await your discovery, each with its own history of ambition and iron and water, each waiting patiently as Warrior waited for someone to remember why it was built.